All right, hi everybody. We're going to talk about evolution today. Hopefully, you had some introduction to evolution when you were in junior high, but I know that most of you don't remember a thing from junior high. So, we're going to be starting from scratch. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about Darwin and what he stated about 100 years ago, a little bit more than 100 years ago. And then we'll dive in deeper after that. Okay, so give me just a second here. Darwin's big idea is called descent with modification, and this is his diagram. Descent with modification, here's a quote: newer forms appearing in the fossil record are actually the modified descendants of older species. So I want you to write down descent with modification, and then maybe with a definition saying all species had descended from an original ancestor, including humans, which was super controversial at the time that he first came up with this idea. So how did descent with modification happen? Well, that's the process called natural selection. That's what he named it. And so we're going to talk about the different parts of natural selection. I want to call them steps, but they're not necessarily sequential. They're just kind of things that have to be happening in order for natural selection to occur. So go ahead and write down natural selection, or how natural selection works, and we're going to give you 4 things to write down. So the first one I want you to write down is overproduction of offspring. What Darwin noticed is that more offspring are produced than can survive. Take a look at the dandelion. How many of those seeds do you suppose actually grow up to become adult dandelions that produce seeds themselves? I wouldn't know, but maybe a small percentage. Think about cottonwood trees and all their cottonwood fluff in the early spring, late spring. How many of those actually grow into adult cottonwood trees that release cotton themselves? I'm sure a tiny percentage. And that's true among all kinds of organisms. There's a video that we sometimes watch about hummingbirds, and the idea that some species of hummingbirds give birth to 24 or so babies within 1 year. They nest and they mate multiple times, but only one or two of them might reach adulthood. So many of their babies aren't surviving. So that's the idea of overproduction of offspring. So you need to understand, and this comes up in one of the steps, that the offspring are competing for limited resources. Mom and dad need to feed them, and they're competing with their siblings. The environment is changing. So maybe there are new food sources, or there are missing food sources. Maybe there's a new predator that's shown up. Maybe there are new climates or new diseases or floods or whatever. So many things that change that cause the offspring to not survive well. And so we have lots and lots of babies being produced, but not lots of them surviving. So number 2 is the idea of genetic variation. Please write that down. So all of these bajillions of babies, they're slightly different if it's sexually reproducing organisms. So all that cottonwood fluff, it's not all exactly the same. These ladybugs, they're not all exactly the same. We might just think of them as ladybugs, but when we get down and look, we see that they come in different colors. They have different numbers of spots. Their spots are different sizes, et cetera, et cetera. So Darwin's idea here is that there are some variations that are useful, that help that species or that particular individual or set of individuals survive better. And he called those variations adaptations, which is a kind of a tricky term, because nowadays we say, oh, I adapted well to that difficult circumstance or something like that. And that's not genetic. That's more of a behavioral example. Whereas Darwin is talking about traits that these organisms are born with. He didn't know what genetics were. Now we have DNA. We understand a little bit, at least, about DNA. And we understand, oh, that's what Darwin is talking about. He's talking about the DNA and how some are born with favorable mutations, and that gives them an advantage in a particular setting. All right, so step number 3, it's not a step, is competition for limited resources. So all of these babies that are being born, they're competing for limited resources. They're trying to get food, they're trying to stay away from predators, they're trying to get out of the sun, or vice versa, into the sun, and so they have to compete. I'll just mention the 2 words down at the bottom, interspecific competition and intraspecific. That will come up again in our ecology unit, but just to have them in the back of your head. Interspecific competition refers to competition between different species. So looking at the zebra and the wildebeest here. Or intra-specific competition is competition between members of the same species. So like these male bighorn sheep. All right, and then the last step or section of natural selection is called differential reproduction. And the word differential is such an intimidating term. I tell students just ignore the IAL, different reproduction. They reproduce differently. Those with the best adaptations are more likely to survive and have lots of babies. The example here is you have a population of beetles that come in two different colors. At this point in their history, they're living on a tree trunk that is brown. And so the brown ones are camouflaged, the green ones are not. The trait is genetic, so they pass on that trait to the offspring. And so the brown ones are reproducing more and having more babies. And so we will see the population gradually become more and more brown. The question is, why doesn't the population become entirely brown always? Why do we have variation within species? Why isn't there just a perfect organism and we're all like that and no variation? And the idea is that variation allows us to change if the environment changes. So now if there's now the climate changes where these bugs are and it becomes more tropical and rainier, maybe a rainforest, and there's moss growing on the tree, for example, or lichens, green lichens on the tree, maybe the green bugs would be at an advantage. And if the green trait had disappeared, then these bugs could theoretically go extinct. That's just sort of all theoretical. So what it says here, offspring are genetically similar to their parents, and that's because they share the similar DNA. Over time, there are more and more and more mutations that lead to more and more and more variations. Eventually, the differences are so great, they call it a new species. And a new species, I define it later on, but a new species is they can't breed with others and produce viable offspring. And so that's when we recognize a new species. So we're still going to have these beetles. They're going to be predominantly brown, but there will still be some green beetles in that population. And that green might be an advantageous trait at some point in their future. All right, so here are some examples of what Darwin is talking about. The first one is artificial selection, and this happens at a very, very fast pace. Artificial selection refers to when humans are purposely choosing organisms with certain traits that benefit them. So usually for agriculture or for they like it, it's cute, if it's an animal or something like that. And it, in essence, speeds up evolution, and evolution wouldn't necessarily ever take these turns because we're not necessarily making these animals better equipped for survival in the wild. A Chihuahua, for example, is not well equipped to survive in the wild. As certainly not as well as a wolf is. We breed these animals because we like them, but not necessarily because they're best adapted for their settings. So examples, crops and domesticated animals. If you take a look at the wolf, what we did is over time, wolves that had preferable traits, whether that was that they were amicable, they were friendly, or whether they were small and we liked that they were small, or that they had an unusual mutation that caused their ears to flip over, whatever, we bred that, and then those traits got passed on to their offspring. And so we can see how natural selection happens when humans get involved. Down below is the corn and its ancestor, the teosinte plant. You can see what the teosinte plant looked like initially, and humans continued to breed for larger and larger kernels and more kernels until we have the type of corn that we have today. Another example, and all you need to do is just write this example down. You don't need to, I'm trying to get my picture out of the way. You don't need to give any of the details, but pesticide resistance. See if you can think about how that's an example of natural selection before I actually give the details. Take a look at the data right here. So DDT is a pesticide that kills mosquitoes. In month 0 in this particular study, 4% of the mosquitoes were already resistant to, they had a mutation that caused them to be resistant to DDT. By month 8, 45% of the mosquitoes were resistant, and by month 12, 77% of them were resistant. What is going on here? Well, that's natural selection. The organisms that had that preferential adaptation, the mutation that made them resistant, they survived better. The others were killed by the DDT. So now this 4%, they don't have to compete with anybody else because they're all dead. And so they start reproducing at a higher rate, and they pass on their genes to more and more and more. And so you see the population start exploding in individuals that have the resistance genes. So it says here, spraying pesticides, which are called bug killers, kills all the pests that aren't resistant. The resistant survivors reproduce and pass on their resistant traits. Resistance therefore increases. Humans spray more, and it repeats, and the process gets worse and worse. Antibiotic resistance, write that down, is another example that we can see very clearly natural selection occurring. We take antibiotics to kill bacteria. We kill most of the bacteria. The bacteria that aren't killed now don't have competition, so they start reproducing and passing on their resistant genes. Using antibiotics kills the bacteria that aren't resistant. The resistant survivors reproduce and pass on their resistance traits. Resistance increases. Humans use different antibiotics. The whole process repeats. There's now varieties of tuberculosis. Last time I checked, that I don't know, maybe we've come up with some new antibiotics since last time I checked, but that are immune or resistant to all forms of antibiotics that we have at this point. All right, and then two more, antiviral resistance. So this is an example with HIV and an antiviral medication. Same thing is happening. Using antivirals kills the viruses that aren't resistant, so that allows the ones that are resistant to reproduce. The resistant survivors pass on their resistance trait, and so forth and so on. And then here's an animal example. Yes, insects are actually an animal. Soapberry bugs. The reason we're talking about bugs and bugs and bacteria is that they have super fast reproductive cycles, so we can see their evolution more quickly than we could with a long-lived animal like an elephant, for example. We can still see that also, but we don't see that within our lifetimes. But we can see the change of bugs within our lifetimes. So soapberry bugs, they have different lengths of what they call their beaks. It's a proboscis. It's something that they inject into the fruit, and then they use it to suck up the juices of the fruit. They normally are found on balloon vine fruit in southern Florida, and there's an image there, and their beak length is specific, and it goes a little bit higher. But they've also been found on an invasive species called the golden rain tree, and the fruit is slightly different, and we've already seen the beak change length to be better suited for that particular type of fruit. All right, and then we're all done with that. I just included two sample problems that you could try. These are ACT test practice questions. Usually you get, I think it's 1 minute or 90 seconds per question. I think that's right. So you can time yourself and try to do these. We've got one problem that's on Darwin's finches and one problem that's on virus evolution. That's it, everybody. Let me know if you have any questions.